Hi, I'm Timothy, and this is Last Memories. I used to think I'd spot revenge coming, but what if there are no signs? What if it's already happening? From a dentist who walks into his office to start a normal day, having no idea someone is already inside waiting for him, to a man on a sidewalk whose exact spot was chosen weeks ago by the person watching him right now. It was February 9th, 2015, in Surabaya, Indonesia. The dental strip along the side street had been quiet for years, with one long-established clinic handling most of the neighborhood's patients. That changed when a new clinic opened just 2 doors down. Cleaner, newer, and offering slightly lower prices. Within weeks, people started switching. Dr. Hasan Minahasa, 54, had run his clinic for over a decade. His days used to be full. Patients trusted him, came back regularly, and recommended him to others. But after the new clinic opened, that started to change. His schedule had gaps, chairs stayed empty, patients canceled and didn't return, and most of them weren't just leaving, they were going next door. The new clinic was run by Dr. Rama Leem, 34, a younger dentist who focused on simple things, cleaner tools, shorter wait times, and actually explaining procedures. And somehow it worked. People trusted him fast, and the difference became obvious. While Hasan's clinic slowed down, Rama's kept filling up. At first, it looked like competition. Then it started to feel personal. Hasan began hearing it directly from patients, from staff, from people in the area. Comments about better treatment, cleaner work, and fewer problems. And then it got worse. A patient who had just been treated by Hasan walked into Rama's clinic the next day, in pain. The extraction had gone wrong. There were signs of infection. Rama treated it. And I think that's the part that really hits. Losing a patient is one thing, but watching someone else fix your work right in front of you, that's a different kind of pressure. And people talked about it. That's what pushed it over the edge. It wasn't just losing patients, it was being replaced, openly compared and talked about. A nearby pharmacy assistant later said patients were saying Rama fixed what the other dentist messed up, often within earshot of Hasan's staff. Hasan confronted Rama weeks before and told him to move. Rama refused. After that, it stopped being about business. It became about taking back control. On the morning of February 9th, Rama arrived earlier than usual. His clinic normally opened at 2 p.m., but he had scheduled time to organize equipment and review cases. CCTV later showed him entering at 12:07 p.m. The street outside was quiet. Nearby shops were still closed. At 12:19 p.m., Hasan entered through the front door, which had been left partially open while Rama was setting up for the afternoon. He did not check in or speak, walking straight inside while Rama was alone in the clinic. Rama was found near the treatment chair. There were signs of a struggle, but not prolonged. The first strike appeared to come from behind, using a metal instrument stand found beside the treatment chair, heavy enough to cause repeated blunt force injury. Multiple impacts followed, focused on the head and face. It didn't stop there. Investigators noted post-mortem damage around the mouth, including injuries consistent with a tooth being forcibly removed using tools from the tray, not for treatment, but as deliberate post-mortem damage. It wasn't done for treatment. It was deliberate. Emergency services were called at 1:02 p.m. after a neighboring shop owner noticed the clinic door partially open. Responders arrived within minutes, but Rama was already dead at the scene. The autopsy confirmed fatal blunt force trauma to the head, with additional injuries occurring after death. CCTV from nearby shops showed Hasan entering the clinic shortly before the estimated time of death and leaving minutes later. No other individuals were recorded entering during that window. Investigators also found traces of blood on clothing recovered from his clinic, matching the victim. Hasan was arrested later that evening at his clinic. He was charged with murder and, upon conviction, sentenced to life imprisonment under Indonesian law. Both clinics closed within months. I think what makes that first one sit heavier is how personal it is. That wasn't random. It was built slowly, face to face, until it crossed a line you can't step back from. And this next case feels different, but the motive behind it isn't. It was May 22nd, 2018, in Da Nang. The hillside resort overlooked the coastline, with clear views of the sea and only a few guests moving through the property that morning. The infinity pool sat along the edge, its surface calm, with a narrow side channel pulling water back into the system. From a distance, everything looked steady and safe. Lena Torres was 27, a food vlogger known for honest restaurant reviews. She didn't soften her opinions or adjust them to keep business owners comfortable. If something was bad, she said it clearly. That's what built her following, but it also made her a problem for people whose income depended on reputation. She had a heavier build, something viewers sometimes pointed out. and in tighter or slippery spaces, it could affect her balance and how easily she could recover her footing. A few months earlier, she reviewed a mid-range restaurant owned by Carlo Reyes, 56. The video was blunt. She criticized the food, the service, and the pricing without offering much room for interpretation. The review spread quickly. Within weeks, the restaurant saw a drop in customers, reservations slowed, and Carlo began losing steady income. What Lena saw as honesty, Carlo saw as something taken from him publicly and permanently. I know she was just doing her job and saying what she thought, but when someone's entire business depends on reputation, that kind of exposure doesn't feel like feedback. It feels like something being taken away. Instead of confronting her directly, Carlo reached out. In early May, he contacted Lena and suggested meeting in Da Nang, presenting it as a chance to collaborate on a follow-up video that could clarify her review and bring customers back. Lena agreed. She brought her camera gear and told a friend she was heading out for a shoot, expecting a controlled, professional interaction. The resort was privately booked, with no lifeguard and minimal staff nearby. 3 days earlier, a maintenance note recorded that the pool system was running at higher pressure than usual. The infinity pool used a concealed intake port along the side channel. After recent maintenance, part of the protective grate had shifted out of place, leaving a section of the intake more exposed than intended. A secondary intake line had also been temporarily blocked, concentrating more suction through that single point. No repair was scheduled. By the morning of May 22nd, Lena set up her camera near the pool, recording casual footage. Carlo stayed relaxed in frame. Staff later said nothing seemed unusual. At one point, Lena stepped closer to the side channel to adjust her angle. The edge was narrow and wet. She hesitated briefly, then continued. At 10:17 a.m., the camera captured Carlo stepping close behind Lena as she adjusted her position along the narrow, wet edge. His hand moved toward her shoulder at the same moment she lost balance, and the contact aligned with her fall. She dropped into the side channel, her upper body landing over the intake. The suction pinned her against the exposed intake, strong enough that she could not pull free on her own. Each attempt to move broke her leverage, keeping the seal in place and preventing her from pushing herself away. From above, it didn't immediately register as an emergency. Her body was partially submerged along the channel, and from a distance it looked like she was leaning into the water. Carlo stayed on the deck and did not enter. Around 10:22 a.m., a child pointed toward her, but the parent assumed she was fine. At 10:24 a.m., a housekeeper noticed something was wrong and called for help. Staff attempted to pull her free, but the suction held. The pump controls were in a locked room, and the system wasn't shut off until 10:31 a.m. By then, she was unresponsive. Emergency services arrived at 10:49 a.m., and Lena was pronounced dead at 11:38 a.m. The autopsy confirmed drowning. Investigators later recovered footage showing Carlo deliberately pushing her into the intake channel, where her upper body landed over the exposed suction point. He was arrested 2 weeks later, charged with premeditated murder, and in 2019 was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. I think what stays with me here is how it never looks urgent from the outside, even when it already is. It's the kind of situation where people hesitate, not because they don't care, but because nothing clearly signals danger yet. And by the time it does, there's no time left to change anything. That one looks controlled, almost calm, like everything is happening right in front of you. But this next case is worse in a different way, because nothing looks wrong at all, not even when it already is. It was Monday, November 20th, 2017 in Kuala Lumpur. The university library had settled into its usual rhythm, with a few students moving quietly through the archive room. The space was narrow and tightly organized, lined with heavy steel shelves filled with old records. Nothing about it suggested risk. Ethan Cruz was 20. A second-year civil engineering student who kept things simple and controlled. He wasn't loud or competitive, but he was consistent, the type who planned ahead, double-checked his work, and avoided shortcuts even when no one was watching. That same habit is what pulled him into something he probably didn't expect. A few months earlier, Ethan noticed patterns in exam answers that didn't make sense, details repeating too cleanly across different students. Instead of ignoring it, he documented everything: screenshots, timestamps, names. What he uncovered pointed to a private group chat run by student officers, where answers were being shared before exams. Once he submitted the report, it didn't stay quiet. The investigation quickly focused on Mark Velasco, 22, a third-year student officer with a full academic scholarship tied to his performance. If the case went through, he stood to lose everything: his position, his funding, and likely his place at the university. Around them, things shifted. Conversations grew shorter, and groups became more guarded. Mark never confronted Ethan directly. 4 days before the incident, on November 16th, witnesses saw Mark entering a restricted corridor near the archive room, using a maintenance key issued to a student assistant. He wasn't assigned there and stayed for just over 20 minutes. Nothing appeared different when he left. That corridor gave access to a rarely used service elevator. In the days that followed, the elevator continued operating as expected. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. A few minor irregular stops were reported, but they weren't treated as urgent. That's a tough one. Reports were already coming in, but no maintenance was scheduled. Ethan signed into the archive at 8:22 a.m. and went about his routine. At some point later that morning, he used the service elevator, likely to move between levels or retrieve materials. There were no witnesses inside. At approximately 9:30 a.m., the elevator doors opened at the landing. From inside, it would have looked like a normal stop. There was no visible warning that the elevator car was not properly aligned behind the doorway. Ethan stepped forward. His foot didn't meet a solid floor. It dropped into the open shaft beyond the doorway. As he tried to recover, his weight shifted forward, pulling his body into the space before he could regain balance. There was no room to brace, no time to react. The doors closed and the elevator continued operating. No one saw it happen. The elevator was used throughout the day by students and staff, with the elevator continued operating, though some users later reported uneven stops and slight jolts that were not immediately linked to a serious fault. It wasn't until the next day, after multiple reports of uneven stops and irregular movement came in, that maintenance was finally called. When technicians opened the shaft, they found Ethan's body lodged inside. Emergency services were called immediately, but there was nothing to reverse. The autopsy confirmed fatal traumatic injuries consistent with a fall into the shaft and crushing within the confined space. Investigators later found the elevator's door interlock had been deliberately bypassed, allowing the doors to open without confirming the car's position. Witness accounts and access records placed Mark Velasco in the restricted corridor days before the incident without authorization. The case was reclassified as intentional. Mark was arrested, convicted of murder, and sentenced to life imprisonment, typically 20 to 40 years. I think this is where it starts to feel uncomfortable, because nothing in that last case looked dangerous until the exact second it failed, and that's the part that sticks with me. It makes you realize how much we rely on systems we don't question, especially in places that feel controlled. I keep noticing the same pattern. Nothing breaks all at once. It's always small things, ignored, left alone, until someone decides to use that weakness. And this next one leans into that completely. It was March 12, 2016. The industrial bakery in Cebu City ran its overnight shift as usual, with flour dust in the air, ovens cycling steadily, and workers moving in routine. Nothing stood out or suggested anything had changed. Quiet but dependable. That was Arvin Salcido, 29, a packaging line worker who had been with the bakery for 3 years. He lived in Mandaue, taking 2 jeepneys before dawn to reach the facility, sending most of his pay back to his mother in Bohol. He kept to himself, avoided complaints, and worked steadily through each shift. Like most workers on the line, he ate from the cooling racks during downtime. It saved money, and no one questioned it. And if we're being honest, if you're standing around fresh bread all night, you're probably doing the same thing. Supervisors described him as reliable and detail-oriented. In 2015, he attended safety meetings and once suggested adding biometric locks to the ingredient storage rooms, an idea that was noted but not implemented. Months earlier, he had reported seeing Joel Mirasol, 30, taking product out through a side exit. The complaint went through management, and Arvin signed as a witness. Joel was suspended, but his access card remained active. According to CCTV reviewed later, Joel entered the facility at 2:14 a.m. on March 12th during a shift overlap, when movement at the loading bay pulled attention away from internal areas. Days earlier, his suspension had been discussed openly on the floor, with supervisors questioning him in front of other workers and limiting his access. Co-workers later said the incident spread quickly, and Joel became the subject of quiet conversations and avoidance on the line. Security later stated that familiar workers workers were often waved through during these periods without strict badge checks. He went directly to the ingredient storage room and stayed inside for 4 minutes. Instead of contaminating ingredients before baking, Joel moved to the cooling area after production began. Investigators later determined he applied a concentrated liquid organophosphate pesticide to a small number of finished pieces at the edge of the rack, targeting items likely to be picked up casually while they cooled, avoiding heat that could reduce potency. By 5:30 a.m., the first batch had finished baking and was cooling on the racks. Workers on the packaging line noticed something slightly off. Not strong, not enough to alarm anyone. Just a faint metallic edge beneath the usual smell of yeast and toasted crust. It came and went depending on where they stood, blending into the heat of the ovens and the normal smells of production. 2 workers mentioned it briefly. One assumed it was leftover cleaning residue reacting to heat. The line didn't stop. Arvin picked up a piece from the cooling rack. He took a bite, paused for a second, and said the taste wasn't right, like something chemical. A co-worker nearby heard it, but early batches sometimes came out uneven, too salty, too dry, slightly off. It wasn't unusual enough to raise concern. He finished the piece anyway and went back to work, handling the rest of the batch as the shift continued. Over the next several minutes, subtle symptoms began to develop. Arvin slowed down at the line, missing the alignment of a tray and not correcting it right away. He wiped his face, then steadied himself against the conveyor for a second longer than usual. His movements became less coordinated as his breathing grew heavier and uneven. At approximately 6:10 a.m., he stopped moving mid-task. He set down a tray unevenly, his hands hovering slightly above it, as if waiting for something to respond. A coworker turned and saw his expression, unfocused, slack, not tracking anything in front of him. The tray slipped from his hands. It hit the floor and scattered bread across the line. Arvin staggered into the metal shelving and collapsed. By the time co-workers reached him, his body was already seizing, limbs rigid, breathing strained. Emergency services were called immediately, but he was already unresponsive and later pronounced dead. The autopsy confirmed organophosphate poisoning, a pesticide applied to finished bread on the cooling rack. The chemical shut down his nervous system, stopping his breathing. During the investigation, CCTV footage showed Joel Mirasol entering restricted areas before production and moving through the cooling section without authorization. Residue matching the pesticide was later found on item S he had accessed. Joel was arrested 2 days later and charged with murder with treachery. In 2018, he was convicted and sentenced to reclusion perpetua of 20 to 40 years imprisonment under Philippine law. Within a month, the bakery installed biometric locks, the same fix Arvin had suggested a year earlier. By then, the system had already failed once. That one doesn't look like revenge at first, but it is, just planned in a way you don't expect. And this next case strips all of that away. No system, no setup, just someone waiting for the exact moment to act. It was May 18, 2016 in Bangkok, where late morning traffic moved steadily, with buses stopping unevenly, motorcycles weaving between lanes, and passengers gathering along curbside stops, while a nearby loading lane doubled as a public pickup point where routine transport and controlled movement overlapped without drawing attention. Daniel Cortez, 41, was a private tutor living in Bangkok, working with a small circle of middle school students and keeping a quiet, predictable routine. That changed when he was charged in connection with a minor, one of his own students. The case didn't dominate headlines, but it drew enough attention that every court hearing was watched closely by the people involved. And there was always one person there. Marco Villanueva, 44, the girl's father, never missed a hearing. He didn't speak, didn't react, didn't confront anyone. He just sat, watched, and left. People who knew him said his life had narrowed to the same loop: work, court, home, over and over. And that's what makes this different, because it wasn't sudden, it wasn't emotional. It was something that built quietly, over months, with no release and no resolution. And to me, that kind of routine doesn't calm anything down. It just keeps everything building under the surface. On the morning of the incident, Marco arrived early. CCTV later showed him at the roadside loading area by 9:12 a.m., standing near a structural column beside a blind spot where the lane curved out of view. It wasn't a secure area. It didn't need to be. He didn't move much, he just waited. And honestly, waiting like that almost looks normal in public. Until you realize he wasn't waiting for anything to happen. He was waiting to make sure it did. And by that point, it wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about finishing something he had already decided. He stayed there for over 40 minutes, standing in place and occasionally adjusting his shoulder bag without sitting, using his phone or interacting with anyone, blending into a space where waiting wasn't unusual. At the same time, Daniel was prepared for transfer from a nearby courthouse annex, escorted by 3 officers toward a transport van along the roadside lane, with his hands restrained in front. The route followed standard short-distance procedure, relying on speed rather than full isolation, moving through a space that blended controlled movement with public access, under the assumption no immediate threat was present. The transfer was classified as low risk, which allowed movement through a mixed-access area rather than a fully secured route. The escort moved without issue as they exited the building and approached the curbside lane, with surrounding noise from engines, conversations, and passing vehicles masking the shift from secured space to open access. While at approximately 9:58 a.m., they reached the curved section of the lane where visibility narrowed briefly before opening again toward the transport vehicle. As they passed the blind section, Marco stepped out from beside the column about 6 feet away, raised a handgun, and fired once, leaving no time for any meaningful response. He collapsed immediately, with no coordinated movement or attempt to react after impact. One officer reached for his weapon while another moved forward, but Marco did not attempt to flee, instead placing the gun on the ground and raising both hands in a controlled motion. A bystander alerted nearby personnel within seconds, and emergency services were contacted at approximately 9:59 a.m., with responders already positioned within the transport network arriving at the scene within minutes, but there was nothing that could be stabilized or reversed. The autopsy later confirmed a single gunshot wound to the base of the skull, entering from behind at close range, with the bullet disrupting the brainstem, the part of the body responsible for breathing, heart rate, and basic function, leaving no delay and no opportunity for intervention. Daniel Cortez died at the scene. Marco Villanueva was taken into custody without resistance and charged with premeditated murder under Thai law, later receiving a life sentence. Footage from nearby traffic cameras and bystanders spread quickly, drawing attention to the public transport setting where security relied on assumption rather than control. In the months that followed, authorities revised transfer procedures through mixed-access roadside zones, increasing separation and reducing public exposure, closing a gap that had gone unnoticed until May 18, 2016. I think what makes this harder to process is how everything around it still looks routine, like nothing actually changed except one moment that no one could stop. The noise, the movement, even the officers doing their job. It all continues as if the system is still working, and somehow, that's exactly what allowed it to happen. That one feels direct. You can point to the exact second it happens, but this last case does something else. It spreads the act out, hides it inside movement, and somehow still lands exactly where it was meant to. It was July 30th, 2013, in a provincial city in Southeast Asia. The stadium was full for the regional finals, and as the last whistle blew, the crowd moved steadily toward the exits. Vendors packed up, voices echoed across the concrete, and nothing seemed out of place. Daniel Kim, 45, had been officiating games like this for 11 years. He was steady, predictable, and trusted, the kind of referee who kept things controlled even when tensions ran high. Off the court, he stayed quiet. Earlier that year, he had filed a report identifying a small group involved in illegal betting tied to game outcomes. He named them directly. The report didn't go public, but it circulated enough that the people involved knew exactly who had written it. And that's where this stops being random, because they didn't forget. The final game that night drew over 3,000 people. 2 of the 4 main exits were partially narrowed by temporary barriers, creating natural bottlenecks as the crowd moved out. Daniel remained near the sideline after the game, gathering his materials beside a fixed concrete post along the perimeter. He always left a few minutes later than everyone else, and that routine didn't change. At approximately 8:41 p.m., 2 men positioned near the east exit began moving against the flow, not shouting randomly, but pushing deliberately into the outgoing crowd. Witnesses later said it didn't feel like panic at first. It felt controlled, targeted, and that's the part that stands out. Because they weren't trying to scatter everyone, they pushed against the flow in a way that disrupted movement near the exit, creating sudden congestion that spread back through the crowd toward the sideline. I've always felt fine in crowds, like as long as everyone's moving the same way, nothing really goes wrong. But when someone forces that movement to change, even slightly, it doesn't take much to turn it into something else. Within seconds, the flow shifted. People near the exit slowed and turned, reacting to something they couldn't fully see, while those behind them kept pushing forward in the original direction. The pressure didn't build all at once. It started gradually, then intensified with each second. It moved through the crowd in waves, transferring force from one group to the next, with no clear starting point, and no way for anyone inside it to understand what was happening. Everyone was reacting, but no one was in control. That movement wasn't random. It pushed through the sideline area where Daniel was positioned, increasing density around fixed structures. At approximately 8:43 p.m., that pressure reached the sideline. It came from behind him, not as a single hit, but as a surge of bodies shifting at once. He stepped to recover, trying to adjust his balance the way anyone would in a crowd, but there was nowhere to go. The space around him had already closed. His right side collided directly with the edge of the concrete post beside him. Witnesses later described how his head struck the edge of the concrete post at an angle, and the force of the impact caused immediate collapse. There was no attempt to brace, no visible reaction. By the time the movement around him slowed and space opened, he was already on the ground, unresponsive. Emergency services were called at 8:44 p.m. and medical staff reached him within minutes. He was transported to the hospital but was pronounced dead at 10:15 p.m. The autopsy confirmed a fatal head injury, blunt force trauma to the temporal region, causing rapid internal bleeding and immediate loss of consciousness. Investigators later reviewed multiple angles of footage and tracked the crowd movement back to its origin. The two men at the east exit weren't reacting to anything. They were initiating it, pushing against the flow in a way that disrupted crowd movement and caused dangerous compression. Phone records and earlier reports linked them directly to the betting group Daniel had identified months before. This wasn't panic, it was pressure, built deliberately and guided through a space where no one could see it forming until it reached him. Both men were arrested, charged with murder, and later convicted. And when you step back from it, that's what closes the loop. Nothing in that moment looked like a direct attack, but every part of it was already set in motion. No weapon, no confrontation, just a system they disrupted in a way that made serious harm likely, until the outcome wasn't chance anymore. It was a situation they created in a confined, high-pressure space,